The first lie about Dry Willow was that the dust ever settled. It didn't. It kept to the air like a held breath, circling the cornices, softening the edges of church steeple and feed sacks and men with rough hands who talked too loud when guilt nipped at them. By noon, most days, the whole town looked like a daguerreotype someone had breathed on. I learned to read dust the way a midwife learns to read a laboring woman's eyes, what it catches, what it hides, how it curls and recoils around a secret, before anyone else knows there is one. On the morning it began, the dust had a different taste to it, metallic, almost sweet. Ivy tasted it too. My little sister pressed 2 fingers to the windowsill of Morell and Daughters Mercantile, our father's name in pale paint and our reality in worn ledger paper, and left little half-moons on the wood. She wore my old work apron tied twice, around her waist, and a stray lock of hair refused to obey the plait I'd braided at dawn. "Storm?" she asked. "Not clouds," I said. "Men." She laughed like I'd told a joke to cut the morning quiet, and then followed my gaze past sacks of flour and a crate of penny nails to the street. Deputy Cormac's new boots flashed black at the corner, slick as a preacher's tongue. 3 more pairs behind him. I recognized the rail foreman, Judd Pike, by the way he chewed, back molar grinding hard like flint on tinder. The 2 others wore the look of borrowed power, shoulders a little too square, hands too eager to land on the butt of a gun and prove they belonged near it. The bell above our door shivered when I touched it. "Mind the counter," I told Ivy. "If the mine, wives come in for calico, charge the blue at 10 cents. Tell Mrs. Baird I set aside the starch. You'll be late to the school boards," she said, meaning the notices I copied for Reverend Thorne every Wednesday, the rot and bustle of our town contained on thin wood sheets, letters blacked in by my steady hand. She pretended my writing was art. Mostly, it was how I worked the numbers no one watched. I won't be long. I carried the ledger like I always did, flat against my ribs, palm warmed to its cover. Most men see books as something you put on a shelf and piously ignore until Sunday. I grew up in books the way some children grow up in riverbeds or under horse bellies, teaching myself a language of small, precise things. My father's numbers kept our store alive through 2 winters and his last coughing spell. When he died, the last page he'd touched had a greasy thumbprint and the words, "Keep accounts straight. Keep the girls safe." I kept both, as best a woman can when the world shrugs at her mouth and nods at her hands. Outside, Deputy Cormac and his trail of certainty were halted by old May, dragging her toll wheel across the street. She collected pennies. For the schoolhouse, with a compulsive fairness no one dared argue. A man who will step over a schoolmarm and her homemade wheel will do worse later. Cormac smiled the way men smile when they mean to bruise. "Morning, Miss May," he said, and lifted the wheel aside with 2 fingers. Rudely placed. That. "Wheel worked hard for the new chalk," May said. "Rude is what you call men who think their boots matter more than children's handwriting." I passed them while they tangled words and habit, head down, skirt hem whispering dust. The depot. He'd clung to the far end of town. Even from here, I could hear the ore carts whining where the iron meets their axles. The Kestrel outfit, Ephraim Kestrel's name, stuck like a burr to half the contracts in Dry Willow, had hit a vein of gold so stubborn it promised fortune only if a man built machines meaner than God. They'd done it with water mostly, new dam upriver at Devil's Gate to grind the ore and sluice the tailings, siphoning a river that was never ours but felt like it. Water rights are paper until they're thirst. We all learned that lesson slow, then all at once. I set the ledger on the broad table in the back of the Mercantile, where I worked the tallies. A fly walked 2 careful steps across the ink before I swatted it away, leaving a smudge between barrel nails, 4D and salt pork, 3 slabs. I flipped to last month's settlements with the Kestrel outfit and saw again something that didn't fit. A payment from County Fund Road Improvement entered under our inventory of kerosene. It was small, $40. But it didn't. Belong, more didn't belong the deeper I read. 7 barrels of creosote no one could account for, a crate of hemp rope marked for the schoolhouse that never arrived, and then, twice circled, as if to dare me to notice, a notation I had missed yesterday because my eyes were gritty and the day had been long. Hooks, forged, 12. Delivery, town yard at Willowstand. Hooks for what? Hooks for who? In a town with more gossip than grain. And a sheriff who wore the law like a coat he'd won in a card game, nothing bought in secret, meant blessing. The back door hinges breathed. I looked up expecting Ivy and found Silas Bracken instead. The rail company's lawyer, thin as a shadow at noon, hat brim narrow the way Easterners like theirs. He smelled of lemon oil and distance. "Miss Morell," he said, and let my name sit on his tongue like a thing that would taste better if it belonged to a man. "Your father always had the neatest books. They're mine now," I said. "So they are." He stepped into the private space of our back room without asking and set his gloves on the ledger as if I'd offered him the page. "Mr. Kestrel asked me to be neighbourly, remind you we've a standing credit with your house, and to fetch the school board notices if you finished them." I had not. The notices were blank still, 3 boards, sanded by my hand at dawn, waiting for the Reverend's words. But something in Silas's voice made me reach for the top board anyway and slide it into the crook of my arm where I could feel its weight. "Neighbourly," I echoed. I thought neighbourly was paying cash on the barrel. His smile never moved. "We all deal in conversions. You trade faith for hope, coin for flour. We trade improvements for patience." His eyes flicked past me and stopped on the corner where my father's old safe sat half hidden beneath a drop-cloth. "May I?" "No," I said. We hung there a moment, the no between us like a drawn curtain. He folded his gloves. I placed my palm over the ledger. "That depot out there?" he said, in a tone so casual it nearly hid the talon. "The dam upriver? Those aren't just iron and lumber. They're a promise. This town's been hanging by threadbare threads, Miss Morell. We intend to weave rope." My fingers, traitors to my face, slid to cover the entry I'd circled. Hooks, forged, 12. "Rope's a useful thing," I said. "Depends what you—" "Untie with it," he said kindly, and tipped his hat. When he'd gone, I let breath out in a thin line and counted to 12 the way my mother taught me to count stitches when my temper rose. Ivy poked her head in before I reached 10. "He left with both ears," she said. "I was ready to clap my hands over them." "You're to clap nothing," I told her. "You're to take Mrs. Baird her starch and keep your tongue." "She owes us 2 weeks," Ivy said, and then softer, because she knew that name belonged in the mouth like a prayer or a wound. "Cass, you've got the ledger open to the Kestrel page." I nodded. "I've been on it since Monday." "You—" "Talk to Beckett?" I kept my eyes on the ink, because the name in her mouth did something to my heart I didn't have room for when numbers felt like nooses. "No." "You should," she said. "He hears things in this town before they occur to other men to think. Them." Beckett Rourke owned the spread on the far side of Devil's Gate, a piece of country big enough to look like a lie whenever a man from back east set eyes on it. He built fences with the sky and kept cattle that moved like dark sentences against the hills. He didn't waste words. He had a wound below his ribs he carried like a decision, and he'd once packed a newborn foal into my apron and stood there with his jaw clenched while I told him where to stitch and how, his great hands doing what. My smaller ones directed with the gentleness a man gets when he chooses it. He had come into the store exactly twice after our father died. Both times he set his hat on the counter and asked, quiet as a rain before dawn, "You need anything carried?" Both times I told him we were fine. Both times he left with crates anyway, salt licks and feed and a crate of glass we were too proud to ask him to lift. Ivy slid onto the stool opposite me, the way only little sisters can occupy space, fully, without permission. "You'll ask. Him now?" "Maybe," I said. Then, because lying to her felt worse than telling her I might be foolish, yes, we closed for our noonday break, which meant we ate our bread heel in the back room, and I watched the alley for men who liked shadows. The sun made its cruel mercy over the roofs, turning every nail a little star. When I finally pinned up my hair again and tucked the ledger into my satchel, Ivy took my wrist. "Don't go to the sheriff," she said. "I'm not nearly that simple," I said, and kissed her hair. I crossed the yard behind the mercantile, turned down Long Mile Street, where the cottonwood leaned like a drunk over the ditch, and followed the narrow path to the Reverend's. On the way, I passed the town yard, where men set fence posts and gossips sharpened their observation into knives. Boys cut willow switches into fishing rods here when they were supposed to be. In school, the willows curled green fingers over the brown water. Under them, where the shade made a kind of room, I saw something that grizzled my skin. 12 hooks nailed neat to a freshly built timber frame, their iron mouths yawning empty. At a height you could step under but not stand tall beneath. There were footprints, too many. The ground there was churned, not by play but by men testing weight. I put my hand to the timber, then pulled it back as if it had teeth. Creosote burned my nose. "Rope's a useful thing," I heard Silas say again in that smooth voice, and fought the urge to spit into the water. I walked away before my stomach could empty bread. I needed to keep a steady head. Reverend Thorne kept a neat parlor and a cluttered study. "Cassia Morell," he said, peering over his glasses like I'd arrived to answer a catechism. "You've got that page of figures look. Sit, speak. I'll pour coffee." "I can't stay," I said, "but I need your hands on something right now." I set the board on his desk and reached for the ink. "You'll post this in front of the church only after the noon bell rings." He squinted at me, read a little from the quick strokes I'd just begun. The announcement of a town meeting on water rights, called by the Reverend's office under the authority of the church. Not strictly legal, not strictly illegal either. "This is going to rattle cages," he said softly. "Then we'll see what snakes are in them," I said. "And I need you to ask Beckett Rourke to come, not by name. Ask the spread. He listens." "You think it's gotten that bad?" "I think hooks aren't for hanging lanterns." He breathed in, slow. "You feel safe walking back?" "Safety's a moving target," I said. And before the ink could dry, I was already standing, the board under my arm. "Ring the bell at noon and pray loud." I stepped into light that felt like an interrogation. The yard at the Willows was empty again. The hooks waited with their lazy mouths. Across the street, Deputy Cormac leaned against the livery with a piece of straw in his teeth and the smile of a man who knows what hour has been chosen to ruin you. He tipped 2 fingers off his brow. "Miss Morell," he said without moving. "Deputy," I said. He let the word stall between us like a lame horse, then looked at my board. "Meeting?" "Church business," I said. "Everything's church." "Business when a woman carries it," he said and grinned. I didn't look at the hooks again. I have learned that sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is not give a man the satisfaction of watching her eyes flinch toward his threats. I left the board propped by the Reverend's door and cut behind the smithy toward the North Road, where the ditch deepened and the willow shade gathered like a whisper. I didn't go looking for Beckett. I walked where a man like Beckett might be if he'd been watching the town from the distance he prefers. I found him where the wind changed, at the rise above the willow yard, looking down with a face that belonged to mountains. "You've been scarce," he said. "I've been busy not drowning," I said. "Seems a popular pastime." His gaze slid from me to the hooks and back, taking both in with a patience I recognized from those nights he worked a needle through a foal's skin and didn't swear once at the pain it caused. "You know what they are for," he said. "I know what they pretend to be for," I said. "Curing rawhide, hanging lanterns, drying meat, all the uses a man writes in a ledger when he wants to pretend it's not meant for necks." He accepted that like he accepted most things, without comment, eyes measuring. Beckett never reached for a woman's elbow to steer her, never said be careful like a talisman to absolve himself. He simply looked until you felt held to the same quiet standard he put on himself. "Reverend's ringing the bell at noon," I said. "Call for the town to meet. I wrote it under his hand. That'll pull hornets from 3 nests, he said. "I want to see what they do when they're angry and watched," I said. "I've found entries in my father's old ledger that taste wrong. Kestrel money where it doesn't belong. Rope where children's chalk should be." He was silent then. "How much rope?" "Enough to tie 12 men together," I said, "or hang 2 women neat and leave some length to spare." "Say it," he said. I was surprised at the anger that rose and poured clean out of me without catching on my teeth. "They'll call it law," I said. "They'll call it justice. They'll call it a debt the town is owed, repayment in the currency of fear. They'll use a tree and say God approves because it's wood." His jaw worked once. "You want help?" It wasn't a question. "I want witnesses," I said, "and men who will not let a rope snug the truth out of throats." He glanced down at the willow yard again, then toward his spread, a dark river of cattle far to the west, his entire life writ in weather and miles. "I'll bring 6, he said, "men who won't shoot until there's no other choice." "My father asked me to keep the accounts straight," I said, "and the girls safe." "Your father knew what the world demands of a dead man's eldest," Beckett said, a strange gentleness in it. "I'll meet you by the church steps when the bell rings." He stood on the mercantile stoop when I returned, cheeks color-slick, eyes bright. "It's already out," she said. "The secret you wanted to keep quiet long enough to set the trap. Mrs. Baird told Miss May, who told Mr. Tuttle, who told Lila at the saloon, and now all the men who don't go to church except to sleep off Saturday are talking about the noon. Bell like buzzards on a fence. Then we've got what we wanted," I said, and smoothed her hair. "Hold your tongue when they come in. Smile like the devil asked you to watch his house." By 11, the town sounded like a pot about to boil. The miners came up from the shaft, black at the edges, hungry for drama. Farmers came in from the sandy edges of the valley on backs that hurt and hearts that wanted to believe a meeting could feed anything more than worry. Women came in 2s and 3s, with knitting their fingers couldn't settle to. Children a half-step behind like shadows detached. I saw Silas again, but he didn't look at me this time. He looked toward the sheriff's office with a paper already prepared. At noon the bell rang. Someone, May, pulled hard enough to make the rope burn her palms. It wasn't a church pull, it was an alarm. Men ran to the steps like a seam tightening. The Reverend lifted his Bible and his chin. "Neighbors," he began, and the word did something to the anger, reminded it of itself. "I called you here because water flows downhill, and so does obligation. We owe our children truth. We owe each other more than the price of a handshake. We owe God not to hide a crooked thing under the name of improvement." He spoke like he always did, plainly enough that even men who didn't like to be told what they owed found themselves nodding. He spoke of the dam and of rights written by men who didn't know the shape of our hills, of cows that drank silt instead of water now, and babies whose milk soured overnight. He did not speak of hooks. He didn't have to. A few men looked over their shoulders toward the willows without meaning to. When he finished, he set the Bible down and lifted the board I'd written. "Here is the meeting I ask for. Tonight. Public, with minutes taken and the doors open, Mr. Kestrel, in his generosity, will send a representative." He let his eyes find Silas. "And we will lay the ledgers on the table." The sound then was not quite a cheer, and not quite a groan. It was a human noise, hope grappling with the memory of being fooled. Silas's smile grew by half an inch. "On behalf of Mr. Kestrel," he said, stepping forward, "we are delighted by the Reverend's interest in transparency." He turned, slightly, and the sheriff came up beside him, all brass star and borrowed backbone. "Sheriff Cormac will ensure the peace." "Peace has a particular look when you wear it like a costume," May said, not softly enough. "Miss May," Silas said, pitying. "I'll bring the ledger," I called, my voice carrying because I made it. "My father's, the one the store has always kept. I'll bring it and show where the money changed hands. I'll ask you to show the same." A buzz like summer locusts, men who didn't know the price of a rope, suddenly very invested in it. The sheriff smiled a careful smile that showed a lot of teeth and no mirth. "Miss Morell," he said, "you speak out of turn." "I speak out of hunger," I said, "and out of thirst, and because my father's ledger deserves a table more honest than yours." The sheriff's hand made a small circle, and two of his men moved through the crowd with the slow swiftness of men who'd practiced it in their heads a dozen times. The paper Silas had brought lay neatly folded on the steps behind the reverend. I knew, because I taught myself the way men think when they want to make a woman small, that if I bent to pick it up, a hand would land on my shoulder. I did not. Ben Beckett Rourke stepped out from the shade then, not into the space beside me exactly, but into the space that included me and made it bigger. He didn't speak. He stood. 6 of his riders found their places at the edge of the crowd like punctuation marks a careful reader leaves. The sheriff's mouth tightened a hair. He tilted his chin at me. "You'll bring the ledger," he said, like it was his idea. "I will," I answered. "Then this meeting will be held," Silas said cheerfully, "and no one will interrupt it with alarmist talk about hooks." The way he avoided the word made it fog the air. We broke up like something uneasy that had been barely held together. Men drifted to the saloon because whiskey makes a fine companion for a trembling hand. Women went to their porches, where they stood with their hands on their hips and watched the street like they were watching a fever in a child, waiting for the turn. I walked with Beckett as if we did that every day. "You shouldn't go home by yourself," he said. "Ivy's waiting," I said. "We'll be quick." He didn't argue. Another kindness. He only said, "I'll walk with you as far as the store." At the corner, a boy ran out of the alley with his hair plastered to his head and his breath running 2 steps ahead of him. "Miss Morell," he panted. "Miss Morell, your back door's open and Mr. Tuttle saw men in your yard who don't buy anything and—" "The ledger," Beckett said softly. I ran. I didn't think to gather my skirt. I ran until the edges of the world blurred and the dust tasted like pennies and prayer. Our back door hung crooked, not broken, just handled by a man who had never been taught to turn the latch gently. Inside, the quiet made a shape I didn't trust. Ivy wasn't at the counter. The bag of dried beans we keep in a blue crock had spilled on the floor like someone had dipped their hand in and then changed their mind. The ledger was not on the table where I had left it. "Ivy," I called, and my voice sounded like a thin girl I didn't know. "Here," she said from the storeroom, calm and also not. I found her standing with her back straight and her chin up and her hands behind her skirts, the way I'd told her to stand when a man needed to be reminded that a woman has a spine. She moved just enough for me to see the ledger tucked behind. 2 barrels, wrapped in waxed cloth and half hidden by the shadow of the shelf. I let out a breath. "You saw them?" "I smelled them," she said. "Silas wears lemon like a sin, 2 of the sheriff's men with him, and Judd Pike." I shoved the ledger and smiled like I didn't notice. They opened the safe and laughed at the empty inside. "It isn't empty," I said. "It is now," she said. "I moved the cash last night like you told me." I put my hand on her shoulder. "Good girl." "They said they had a warrant," she added. "Silas can write those with his eyes closed," Beckett said from the door. "Doesn't mean a judge signed it." Ivy looked at him the way girls look at mountains and at horses that choose not to bite. "You'll stay?" she asked him. "For a bit," he said. "Do you have a back way out of town that isn't obvious?" I nodded. "Through May's garden, over the irrigation ditch, across Mr. Tuttle's broken fence, and then the dry wash all the way to the church lot. It smells like onion, so no one follows it long." "Show me," he said. We made 3 trips before supper, moving nothing that would tell a thief we valued it. The ledger wrapped and tied beneath Ivy's shawl. The little box of father's letters in my satchel. The family Bible, which got heavier with each yard, like it knew how much it had stored that wasn't written in it. We left everything else where it lay, so a glance through our window would say, "Poor girls, nothing here but buttons and beans and old papers." Men who take inventory with their eyes fall for that lie a dozen times. At dusk, the town turned the color of old bruise. The willow yard looked almost gentle. The hooks made negative moons against the dark. Silas and the sheriff took their place early in the hall. We used the schoolhouse as a meeting hall when we needed it, stacked paper like ammunition. 3 men sitting behind them with heads like plow handles and eyes that didn't blink at suffering. Neighbors filled the benches. Beckett stood at the back with his 6, quiet as thunder you hear only if you know what to listen for. Reverend Thorne opened his book and wrote the date. I opened mine and set it beside his. "Let's begin," Silas said brightly, as if we'd gathered to bless a harvest. We began the way a woman in labor begins, respecting the work of breath first. Numbers are a mercy. They make men show themselves. I read the columns. I read them so careful you could hear the page scratch against the table when I turned it. I read out purchases the county had made at our store, oil, resin, rope, and then asked the room whether anyone could say where those things had gone. "Road repairs?" said one of the plow-handle men. "Show me where the road was repaired," I said. He looked at his shoes. Silas spread his hands. "Supplies are shifted. It happens." "Not in books it doesn't," I said, and I felt Beckett tilt, just a hair, like he appreciated a clean strike. We moved point by point. I didn't accuse. I asked. It's a trick old May taught me. Let a man walk himself to the cliff and decide whether to jump. Each time Silas smiled. Each time the sheriff's jaw clenched a tick harder. Each time men who have worked land all their life looked at other men who had worked papers and asked themselves which work hurt their hands more. When I reached the hooks, I didn't say the word. I put my finger to the line and let the room rid it with me. A noise ran through the benches like wind across wheat, not loud, not quiet. Somewhere in the back, a woman's knitting needles stopped. "Drying racks," Silas said immediately, "for the schoolhouse to use when painting pictures for Founders' Day." "In the willow yard," I said. "Where there's shade," he said, as if explaining something to a slow child. "The teacher keeps the children in the yard at midday," old May called from the back, "because the schoolroom boils. That shade keeps them from baking." "The shade's useful for many things," Silas said. "We've made improvements to town property at our expense. You're welcome." "You can afford to be generous with other people's water," I said. Something ugly flickered behind his eyes. He opened his mouth, and the door behind us banged. Judd Pike stepped in with a smile that had rocks in it. He walked down the aisle and set a canvas sack on the front table. The sack thumped the way ropes do. I felt my stomach step off a familiar ledge. Beckett's breath moved behind me like a bull deciding whether to charge through a fence. The sheriff didn't look at the sack. He looked at me. "Enough," he said, sharp. "We've listened to your ledger. Now you'll listen to mine." He unfolded Silas's paper with ceremony and cleared his throat. "Cassia Morell," he read, like he'd practiced the name in front of his mirror. "Accused, by affidavit, of theft of county property, an incitement to riot, aiding and abetting the spread in obstruction of lawful water use." There was a laugh from someone whose name I knew and didn't want to attach to this moment. It sounded like a plank snapping. Ivy's hand found mine. "Don't move," I whispered. "Whatever they expect you to do, don't. She'll come quietly," Beckett said from behind us, voice low and even. "No," the sheriff said, and the way he smiled told me we were past the part where men pretend to be reasonable. "No, she won't. She's going to come loud enough to teach others the cost of not minding their own business." He nodded at Judd Pike. Pike loosened the cord on the sack and drew out 2 coils of rope, fresh as bread. The room went narrow. I felt the edges of it press. Someone sobbed once. the way strong women do when the body finds the sound before the mind has time to tell it hush. Reverend Thorne stood up so fast his chair fell. "Sheriff," he said, "you will not bring violence into God's house." Then, "Step out," the sheriff said. "We'll hold our lesson under God's sky." Judd and the plow-handle men came down the aisle in a way that made the floor seem to lean toward them. Beckett moved at the same moment, but 3 others moved too, a triangle closing, men who had been polite at the edge of things all evening and now showed their mettle. One of them pressed a barrel to Beckett's ribs. He didn't flinch, and it felt like a kind of prayer. "Don't," I said to him. "Please." He met my eyes. What I saw there made time slow, not fear, calculation. How a man takes apart a fence and builds it again in his head so the cattle don't spook. He stepped back half an inch, which looked like surrender if you didn't know him, and looked like patience if you did. They took Ivy and me in a way that didn't leave bruises where you can see them, ends like clamps at the back of our arms. "Walk," Judd said, with breath that smelled like the bottom of a drip wagon. We walked. The town walked with us because people can't help but follow the sound of a bad thing about to be done. The sky above the willow yard looked wide enough to hold a mercy and stubborn enough to deny it. The hooks waited, neat as a lie on Sunday. "Cass," Ivy said, her fingers digging crescents into my palm where she'd found it again. "We didn't do anything wrong." "That's not the kind of wrong this is about," I said. "They put the ropes over the hooks in a way that made it look like habit. They tied the knots like they'd practiced on sacks of grain. Everything took on the gentle slowness of a thing already decided, like the way a plate falls in a kitchen. There's 2 kinds of time when it goes. The time when you can catch it, and the time when you can only watch the shards find the floor." Silas stood with his hands folded and a look of concern he could put on and take off like a coat. The sheriff stood with his badge shining and his eyes flat. Reverend Thorne stood with his fists at his sides and his mouth moving. I didn't need to hear the words to know their shape. Beckett stood with stillness that meant motion was coming. 6 of his men spread like a blackbird's wing. Judd Pike climbed the timber frame like a man who's done it enough to forget what it symbolizes. He tossed the first rope down. It smelled like oil and fibers and something I decided not to name. "Ladies," he said. "Ivy trembled so lightly that you wouldn't have seen it if you hadn't held her bones all your life." I squeezed back. "Sheriff," Beckett said, in that voice he used to settle a spooked mare. "No one gets what they want if you do." I get exactly what I want," the sheriff said and smiled. He nodded. The men on either side of us lifted the ropes. They didn't put them on our necks yet. They let the loops hang like halos grown wrong. They wanted time to feed the fearful part of a crowd that finds relief in seeing someone else chosen. "Cass," Ivy whispered, "he's watching you." "Who?" "Beckett." I could feel it like heat. He wasn't watching the sheriff. He wasn't watching the men with their rehearsed cruelty. He was watching the spaces between them, the split second it takes for a man to reach and then look away, the smudge of creosote on a hand that would leave a mark on a belt and tell you which one carried the extra pistol. "Sheriff." "Reverend," Thorne said louder now. "This is lynching. This is law," the sheriff said, not letting the word catch on his teeth, "rendered by the consent of righteous men." "Righteous men don't hide their faces under dust," May called from the back, her voice like a fry pan thrown at a coyote's. Judd dropped the first loop. It hung at the level of my eyes, round and patient. My brain did a strange thing then, the way it does when a baby, crowning, looks bigger than a woman should have to bear. It counted small things. The frayed end, the knot's good work. How? The rope would scratch if it touched skin. My mouth moved without my permission. "Ivy," I said, because sometimes the only thing a woman can do is say a name out loud so someone knows the weight of it. "Now," the sheriff said. Beckett moved. He didn't run like a hero in a dime novel. He moved the way a man pulls a calf from breech, hands sure, motion exact, refusal complete. He was at my side between one heartbeat and the next, his shoulder colliding with the man who held my rope so precisely that the loop fell and bit dirt. Behind him, his six unfolded from the edges of the crowd like a story we'd forgotten was ours. The first shot cracked like a board broken clean. Judd Pike shouted. Men turned with guns they hadn't expected to fire yet, and found themselves looking at men who knew where to point them without killing anyone. Hands, knees, the places you cut a snake without losing your soul. Someone screamed my name. Ivy. Or my mother's ghost? The sheriff drew. So did Silas, not a gun, but a piece of paper he held up like it could stop a bullet. "Warrants!" he cried. "Warrants!" Thunder rolled over the hills. Not weather. Not yet. Hooves. More men. I saw them as dots over the rise, and then as riders, 20, maybe more, moving fast in a wedge that looked like a choice barreling toward us, dust lifting behind them like a book's last page riffling. Beckett's hand found my arm, hard enough to bruise, blessing enough to feel like a command. "Down," he said. The sheriff's muzzle lifted. I heard the breath before the trigger. I saw the knot on the rope like a black eye. I felt the ground come up to meet me, cool and hard and real. Then a voice cut through the yard, hard, carrying, iron bent to purpose. "Drop the ropes," it said, "or every man behind me rides straight through you." The riders broke the ridge like a storm breaks, a flood with rains. The loop of rope swung over my head like a question that hadn't decided who would answer it. "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're from. If this story moves you, please subscribe. Tomorrow, I have a special story for you." The riders didn't slow. They poured off the ridge in a wedge, then fanned with the unshowy precision of men who have ridden fence together in hail and in heat. The air filled with the thrum of hooves and the old smell of leather that means help when you're drowning. Whoever had shouted, "Drop the ropes," didn't shout again. He didn't need to. The line of horses made the argument for him, iron on stone, breath like steam, reins taut as violin strings. A gun cocked to my left, another to my right. Beckett didn't look at either. He stepped once, twice, the way a man moves around a skittish mare. Shoulder to the big-boned hand that held my loop. The rope fell. The loop kissed dirt and threw up a little ring of dust. Ivy made a sound in her throat that tore at me like a saw against green wood. "Back," the sheriff barked. His voice had too much brass in it. "This is county business." "County business has a different smell," someone answered from the riders' front rank, and rolled to a stop so clean it looked like a trick. He was a broad-shouldered man with a grey beard that looked carved, eyes like cold water. Coulter, Vale of the 3V, Beckett's neighbour west of Devil's Gate. Vale lifted his palm, and his line steadied behind him. "And it doesn't tie women in front of children." Silas moved to the middle, as if the space had been reserved for him. "Mr. Vale," he said, lemon-sweet, "you bring hired hands to interrupt a lawful proceeding? Call it a neighborly—" "A visit," Vale said. His gaze slid to the timber and the 12 iron hooks. "Call it a reminder that we've got long memories in these hills." "Rourke," the sheriff said, as if he hadn't heard a word Vale spoke. "Call your men off. You're outgunned and out-authorityed." The word wobbled on his tongue. Beckett didn't raise his voice. "No one's here to fire first." "Then you're here to watch," the sheriff said, and nodded at Judd Pike. Pike didn't hesitate. He grabbed the second coil, and with a neatness that made me want to bite the inside of my cheek until I tasted copper, he slid the loop up under Ivy's chin. The whole yard narrowed to a single scratch of rope fibers against my sister's skin. "Don't," I said. It came out like a weather prayer. "Do it," the sheriff said. Judd yanked. The world tilted. Ivy's heels left the dirt a finger's breadth. She kicked once in astonished air, not fighting, not yet understanding. The body tries to make sense of a hurt before it fights it. The loop tightened and bit, and her eyes went wide and animal. Everything that had ever been quiet in Beckett moved. I didn't see his knife leave its sheath. I saw his shoulder drive. I saw his left hand seize Ivy's hips and lift. I saw steel flash once, and the rope part like a sentence cut before its verb. Ivy fell against him. The noose swung back empty, a mouth surprised it had been refused its meal. A man fired from the crowd, wild, high. Vale's line answered with a single flat shot that took the shooter's pistol out of his hand and left his fingers smarting and his pride bleeding. "Next gun that fires, I start taking hands," Vale said. He didn't raise his voice either. "You don't raise a voice like that. It carries because it knows it should." Silas let his expression go grave. "Mr. Vale, Mr. Rourke, this is regrettable theatre. The sheriff has warrants." He lifted the paper again, as if paper could block the shape of a hook. "Read them at the church," Reverend Thorne said. His voice had found iron. "Where? They can answer back without ropes around their throats." "Step away from the Morell girls," the sheriff ordered, louder now, because fear will make an order louder when it knows it's thin. Two of his men moved to flank Beckett. Vale's riders shifted with them, a slow river answering a rock. "No one moves," Beckett said. The knife he'd used to cut Ivy free lay flat against his forearm, invisible if you didn't know where to look. "No one touches them." Judd Pike's eyes had gone small and hard. He grabbed for the dropped loop at my feet, faster than thought, and with a flick like roping a calf, he threw it over my head. The rope found the place beneath my jaw. He hauled. The sky stepped forward. Pain, clean, white-edged, split up into my mouth and behind my eyes. I heard my name, torn from somewhere close, and understood it as someone else's before I understood it as mine. There are two kinds of time when a rope catches a throat. The time that has room, where you can think and argue and bargain, and the time that has none, where the body becomes a bell and the world rings through it. I hit the second kind so fast the first never saw me leave. The beam above groaned. The sound wood makes when it's asked to be a neck. Ivy's hands were on the rope. Beckett's palm was on the back of my head. Vale's horse wheeled. Judd braced and pulled like this was the one deed in his life he meant to do right. My feet found air and then nothing, and then Beckett's boot. He hooked it behind my heel and bore up. "Hold," he breathed, and it sounded like he'd put the order into his bones, not mine. Everything sharpened, the ditch's onion smell, May's breath counting God in fours, Silas's lemon slick, the sheriff's badge catching a sunbeam that had no business shining on it. I reached for Beckett's shoulder, not like a lover reaches, but like a drowning person does, a contract between two mortal things. "Cut it," Vale said. "On it," someone answered, one of the six, and then I felt the rope go slack and the ground came up under my boots. I sucked air the way you do after a birth, the first breath like glass, and the second like water. Ivy's hands were on my face. "Cass," she said, which was enough. "Down," Beckett said to us both. He didn't say please, he said it like a man who had watched death fumble and was not going to give it another try. He put his body between ours and the frame, and I let him. The yard held still a long second, too still, like snow balanced on a ridge. Then the ridge broke, not with gunfire, with hooves. More riders cresting from the east this time, dust-caped, faces set. Not Beckett's men, not Vale's. Company men. Kestrel's brand burned into their horses' rumps like a boast. Their leader took off his hat to show a smile. "Afternoon," he called. "I'm told there's a disturbance." "August Merritt," Beckett said, low. I knew the name. Kestrel's. Bastonero, the man who does things a gentleman keeps his cuffs white to ignore. He wore his coat too neat to be from here, and his eyes too merry to be anything but a weapon. "Sheriff," Merritt said, as if greeting a partner stepping on stage. "Need a hand?" "We're teaching manners," the sheriff said, and smoothed his vest. Merritt looked at the frayed ends hanging from two cut loops and made a small, disappointed moo. "Someone interrupted your lesson." He let his gaze travel across Vale's, riders, and settle on Beckett. "Neighbor," he said cheerfully. Beckett didn't answer. Merritt's smile deepened. "Mr. Kestrel's compliments," he said. And a reminder, the county has contracted us to help with order. A town can't grow with women making a fuss about ledgers and water. Someone has to tighten the lid. He spurred 2 steps forward. So, shall we tighten? Not today, Vale said. Today, precisely. Merritt's hand twitched, the signal you give men who are primed to move. Guns came out like arguments prepared in advance. I had one thought, Ivy. I reached for her. Without taking my eyes off Merritt, Beckett impossibly found both of our wrists and pulled us a foot back, then another, angling us toward the willow's deepest shade. Rourke, Merritt sing-songed, as if we were children at recess and he'd spied a hiding place. Bring your girls back. We'll keep things civil. You don't know the word, Beckett said. A shot cracked from the edge of town, not from any of the tense lines. A warning. Then another. Other sounds folded into it. The flat clap of doors slamming, the shriek of a hinge, the tumble of feet. When the dust lifted, I saw them. Townsfolk, not riders, not hired hands, men with hammers, women with skillet irons and rakes. Old May with her toll wheel held like a shield. They had not brought guns. They had brought whatever their hands touched every day. Merritt saw what I saw and laughed in surprise. Well, he said, we've organized ourselves a parade. We've organized ourselves a witness, Reverend Thorne said, stepping off the church steps and down into the yard with the Bible in his hand and a face drawn into lines I hadn't seen before, lines that said, I am afraid, and I will not move. Any man who fires now does it in front of the town that feeds his family. Then we'll make sure the town can't feed itself, Merritt said pleasantly, and turned his horse as if the matter had been decided. He put 2 fingers in his mouth and whistled toward the east road. From that direction came a new sound, the thick, breathy surging of water when it's been told to run where it doesn't want to. My throat, raw under my jaw, went cold. Devils. Gate, Beckett said. They've opened something. Merritt tipped his hat. Improvements, he said. You'll love them. He wheeled his horse, and his line followed, doubling out into the road, heading east at a canter that promised a gallop once out of sight. The sheriff stood in a confusion that didn't sit well on his face, and then resolidified. Arrest them, he started, and stopped when not a single man moved. Tonight, Vale said to him, you want to read your papers? You do it at the meeting like the Reverend called? Do it with the town in the room? Or what? The sheriff snapped. Or we'll read some papers of our own, Vale said, signed by more men than your badge can count. We've had enough of ropes. The sheriff spat dust he hadn't earned, and stalked off with Judd and 2 others in his wake, snapping at boys who weren't in anyone's employ not to stand in his way. Silas lingered a heartbeat longer. Miss Morell, he said, you're making trouble over a handful of bookkeeping errors. That's not brave, it's childish. I was a child when I learned to add, I said. It made me dangerous. He smiled like I'd told him a compliment. We'll see you this evening. He touched the brim of his hat to Beckett the way a man tips to a gravestone and sauntered after his sheriff. The yard exhaled. The crowd moaned, a sound of fear released, not relief achieved. The rope ends swung in a lazy cross breeze. I put my fingers to the place the knot had kissed, felt the ridged tenderness and breathed once, slow, on purpose. Come, Beckett said. Doc will look at that. Ivy first, I said. I'm fine, she lied, her voice a little sanded. I just don't like the smell of creosote anymore. No one does, May said briskly and put an arm around Ivy like an Aunt You. Inherit by collective will. Come on. We'll wash that off your skin and your memory, and I'll set a chamois under your braid so your neck doesn't feel a hair touch it for a week. To Beckett she said, you go look where the river's been told to forget itself. We'll have the girls at the store when you're done. Beckett looked at me. I want to see Devil's Gate before they close whatever they've opened. I'm coming, I said. He shook his head. not like a man saying no to a woman, in order to keep his sense of himself, but like a man laying a plank straight. If Merritt's thrown the sluices wrong, a horse needs its head on the switchback trail. You ride like a bookkeeper. Books don't buck, I said. He almost smiled. Take wit, he said, one of Vale's riders, and Brazos. They'll get you as far as the lower trail on the south bank. Keep eyes open. Ride in the brush when the road curves. If you see a kestrel shirt, turn and ride back like your hair's afire. You'll meet me at the bend above the old sycamore, I said too quickly, because I didn't want my voice to show how the word hanged still rang inside my skull. Above the old sycamore, he said. By the time a man could cook a steak both sides, he went east at a ground-eating lope. Vale peeled 4 riders after him and left 2 to companion me. I hugged Ivy, feeling her ribs, and then again without letting go so quickly, we could both pretend it had been the same hug. Store, I said. Lock the front, bar the back. Let May bully you. Don't open the ledger. Don't answer the door if it smiles. Come back, she said. Count on it. We took the south trail, Wit leading, Brazos riding. Drag. The path snaked the way water had once done, before men made it forget its own logic. Grasshoppers clicked up from our horses' knees. A hawk wrote a dark sentence across a pale sky. The river showed itself in blue shards between cottonwoods, and each time it did, I looked and looked, counting. The sound changed as we closed. The regular talk of flow gave way to a brag, a rush, a quarrel between current and stone. At Devil's Gate, the gorge necks itself narrow. The rocks on either side are black where high water scours them, and red where it only threatens, and the air there smells like iron and prayer. Kestrel's dam, banjos of cribbed timber and poured concrete, the strange marriage of old and new, bit into both walls like a bad tooth. The spillway had been dry since July. Now it ran a thin white line that thickened as we watched. Wit pulled up and threw his reins. They opened the side gates, he said. Not the main. That's a bleed. To make a point not to flood a town. Points can drown a child just as sure, Brazos said, and spat in a way that had judgment in it. I tied my mare and went up the last yards on foot. The dam had a little catwalk, a string of planks with a polite rail so Easterners could look down at the river and decide they had improved it. Halfway across, I stopped and set my palm to the new flow. It felt like a pulse. It felt like a body running a fever. A shout came from the far end. Beckett, he lifted his hand in that small way. Mendu, when loudness would be a kind of surrender, and I felt the muscles in my neck that the rope had roused tighten and then let go. With him were 2 of Vale's men and, unexpected, Doc Green, hat clamped low, eyes narrowed against glare. Doc, I said when he came close enough for my voice to reach in a normal human way. Someone had to decide if we were seeing danger. Or complaint, he said. Turns out it's both. He pointed with his jaw at the overflow canal, where water ran where it shouldn't and carried with it a skin of grey-yellow scum. That's not silt. What is it? I asked, though part of me already knew. Tailings, he said, mill wash. There's a smell to poison the law likes to pretend it can't smell. He glanced at me without saying your father kept notes like a priest. I could hear it anyway. You got a jar? I did. In my satchel, because the world had already taught me that truth sometimes needs a bottle. I handed it over, and he reached down with that surgeon's patience of his and scooped a portion of the water's shine into it. When he held it up, it looked like mercy had been skimmed off, and what remained had decided to be ugly. Sheriff. We'll call it mud, Brazos said. Sheriff can come taste it, Doc said. If his mouth doesn't go numb, I'll let him call it whatever he likes. We crossed to the control house, new timber, raw with ironwork that actually knew its business. Beckett stopped me with a hand on my sleeve before we stepped in. Let me, he said, and went first. Head turned, shoulder angled, the polite courtesy of a man who intends to take a bullet if one is waiting and is ready to curse me later for not letting him. Inside, it smelled like creosote and gun oil. There was a desk, a map with coloured thread pinned through it to show the irrigation ditches Kestrel promised the county, and a series of levers numbered neat. One lever had been yanked half down and locked there with a padlock that looked new, enough to have someone's breath still on it. "Side gate 3, Beckett said. "They opened it and chained the lever where a man can't shut it without a saw." "Judd Pike doesn't carry a lock," Witt said. "That's a lawyer's. Brain at work. Make mischief look official." The map drew my eye. They had marked the schoolyard willow stand with a tidy X, as if it were a landmark on a pleasure cruise. Underneath in pencil, a word, staging. Staging what? Lunch or something with ropes? It twisted something in me that hadn't righted since. Noon. I leaned over the map, smelling the graphite, reading the tiny notes in the margins, the way I had read my father's, when I didn't yet know his ghost would ask me to carry them. 2 columns on the bottom right. Supplies. Townyard, creosote, hemp, iron hooks, supplies, control house, blasting powder, 2 crates, caps, tar. "Blasting powder," I said, and felt the middle of my body go cold. Doc looked where I pointed, then at the walls as if expecting them to confess. "I don't like that word inside a building that holds back a river." "Where?" Beckett asked. Brazos had the sense to stay by the door, watching the trail. Witt bent, ducked, knocked his knuckles along the baseboards, then lifted the tables, cloth and stiffened. "Here," he said, "and not 2 crates, 4. Beckett crouched, fingers gentle, as if dynamite were a live thing he didn't want to startle. The slatted boxes had company stencil marks, but someone had rubbed dirt into them in an artful way, so they looked older and more honest than they were. The twine was new, the nails were new, the lie was old. They meant to blow a piece of the spillway, he said. Let water do the rest. They'd call it a failure of old wood. They'd call the new concrete an improvement after the flood. "Tonight?" Doc asked. "Soon," Beckett said, or when a woman didn't stop asking questions. His eyes flicked to me without needing guilt to do the looking. "We have to move this out of here. We can't carry it far without looking like men who mean to blow something," Witt said. "And if Merritt is half as clever as his smile suggests, he's got boys on the ridge, counting how many crates leave this house." "Then we don't carry it far," Beckett said. He straightened, decision settling into him like a saddle sits. "Right on a horse that's earned it. We dump it in the low pool below the bend. Water'll take the temper out of it for a spell." Doc shook his head. "It won't drown the idea. It'll give us time to bring a judge with eyes," Beckett said. "Time's the only favor we can ask of this day, and it owes us already." We moved like a nest of ants interrupted, purposeful, splitting work by unspoken rule. Witt and Brazos bore the crates one by one to the catwalk, while Beckett kept the jar steady in Doc's hands, and I took the map down and rolled it slick. "Take it," Doc said. "A thing drawn tells a truth a mouth can wiggle away from." We were 2 crates in when a shadow climbed the control house door and didn't go away. Beckett had time to set the map down and lift the top crate onto Witt's shoulder before the shadow grew a voice. "Busy day at the gate?" August Merritt leaned against the frame like he belonged there, sunlight cutting a clean shine along his teeth. He took in the padlock, the open map drawer, the missing crates, and smiled like you only do when you know something and want to watch a woman figure out that you do. 3 men behind him, not boys, company, not county. "I file things more neatly." "When I'm nervous," I said, "because sometimes you answer a wolf by whistling like a canary. It buys you one breath." Merritt took his hat off and fanned himself with it. "Miss Morell," he said, "the ledger lady. You have a talent for arriving where paper turns to powder." He gestured with his hat brim at the empty space under the table. "Taking souvenirs?" "Returning them," Beckett said. "To water." "Wasteful," Merritt said. "Blasting has so many uses. Clearing sediment, widening channels, trimming a town off a river so it sits polite when men with money want to build where they please." He looked out across the spillway, where the water ran thicker now, white lace at its lip. "Mr. Kestrel likes a view." "You left a word on that map," I said, "because my mouth will save my hands if it can." "Staging." He didn't bother to glance. "You believe everything you read?" "I do when the ink's still wet." He smiled as if I'd passed an exam. "You weren't meant to see it." "I wasn't meant to breathe this morning," I said. "Men fail at meaning all the time." The marks under my jaw burned under their band of cotton. The world telescoped around the space between Merritt's boots and mine. He sighed. "Don't look at me like that, Miss Morell. I didn't come to rough the ledger girl. I came to close a gate. Some things are better done under a man's hand." He jerked his chin, and one of his men shouldered inside and cut the padlock with a tool he had brought for that single purpose. "Close it," Merritt told him. The man reached for the lever. Beckett moved to stop him, and two other guns answered, by lifting a fraction. Vale's men in the doorway behind Merritt didn't step in. They stood and calculated. Beckett didn't push it. He stepped back that half-pace I knew, a step that said patience and not surrender. The lever creaked, too, closed with a reluctance that made the hair on my wrist stand. The spillway narrowed from a lace to a thread. "See?" Merritt said. "Law and order. It's almost as though the world obeys men who know how to ask it nice." "More like it obeys men who come with guns," Doc said. "Words are guns," Merritt said. "I'd have been a preacher if there'd been a pulpit big enough." He nodded again. Two men stepped to either side of Beckett and let him know with a touch what their guns had already promised. Merritt's eyes came back to me as if time were an intimate of his, and he could make it wait while he talked. "Miss Morell," he said, "I've been meaning to congratulate you. Not many bookkeepers can read a page hard enough to make a town sing. You must be proud." I felt pride, and something like nausea walked through me arm in arm. "I'm small," I said. "That makes men with big plans angry when they trip over me." He laughed. "You've got teeth. I'll grant you that." He let his gaze flick to Beckett just once. "And a dog." "Careful," Beckett said level. "Dogs remember." "I'm counting on it," Merritt said. "Dogs will bring a thing back to hand, especially when you throw it far." He turned, as if to go, but paused. And the way he paused was the way a hunter pauses when he hears brush move 2 ridges over and knows which way the deer will spin. "Oh," he said lightly. "One more thing. You got a sister, Miss Morell?" Blood left my hands. "Yes." "Pretty thing," he said, as if he were complimenting a horse's pasterns. "Quick with her tongue, not quick enough with her feet. Your friend Silas has a paper with her name on it and some other words it's best not to learn to read." He set his hat back on his head tenderly. "He asked me to be sure she don't wander before tonight's meeting." I said I'd oblige. Beckett's jaw did a thing you only see when a man calls all the promises he ever made and tells them to. "Stand ready." "Where?" he asked. Merritt looked at his fingernails. "At the yard," he said, "where a town keeps its tools." He looked up and smiled. "Don't fret, we won't use all 12. He left then with the careful carelessness of a man who knows he's dragging something behind him that will come no matter how slow he goes. His men backed out with him, neat, eyes on us, guns not pointing, but not pointing. The light that had been blocked by their bodies came back into the doorway and made dust glitter like it had news. "Cass," Beckett said. "I know," I said. I could feel the rope's ghost under my jaw and the pressure of Ivy's hand on my palm, and the map rolled in my fist and the jar in Doc's pocket and Beckett's stillness. I could feel all of it, and none of it mattered next to the simple fact of my sister's name in the mouth of a man who thought rope was a reasonable punctuation mark. Wit was already moving. "South Bank is faster," he said. "Cut across. The floodplain. If they're staging at the Willows, the North Road will be watched." Doc put the jar into my satchel and pressed my hand until I had to look at him. "If you can't outfight them, Outtime them, he said. Make them late. To their own ugliness. Beckett's eyes met mine and gave me the thing he never gives a person who can't carry it. The truth, without padding. If they meant to frighten her, they'd put her where we could see, he said. If they meant to hold her, they'd put her where a small posse makes a large mess. If they meant to finish this... He didn't say it, and I loved him. For the mercy. We've got a very little while. We'll make a while, I said, and surprised myself with how steady it came out. We left the crates where they sat. We couldn't move them under eyes, and ran for our horses. The south trail fell away under us. Beckett rode like a map he'd drawn himself. I kept up because you can make a horse understand some things a human takes a year to teach. When a woman leans forward and tells it with her whole body that speed is what keeps a sister breathing, the horse believes her. At the willow yard, the sun had slanted to that angle where a man's shadow looks longer than his worth. The frame stood clean as scrubbed bones against the green. The crowd had thinned. Fear makes people find chores. But there were still knots of women and boys at the edges, like lilies around rot. And in the center, on a crate, hands tied before her, braid falling like a promise cut and tied, Ivy, Silas, stood to her left, with the kind of sorrow some men put on like a vest. Miss Morell, he said when he saw me, lifting his chin like he'd been called by a judge into a courtroom he'd bought. You are invited to meet with me at Mr. Kestrel's office to discuss the unfortunate errors in your family books. He held up a paper I did not read, because all I could see was the knot they had tied at my sister's wrists, and the way her mouth was set so she wouldn't give them the sound they wanted. If you decline, I'm afraid the sheriff will have to proceed at once with a public safety demonstration. Demonstrating what? Vale asked from the fence line, his voice a plain plank. Silas looked pained. Consequences. Consequences for what? I asked. My voice sounded like it had walked a long way barefoot. For riot, Silas said, which meant not doing what he told us. For theft, which meant telling the truth about where county money had gone. For obstruction, which meant refusing to let men who didn't own it own a river. Untie her, Beckett said. I will, Silas said with a smile that missed his eyes. When Miss Morell agrees to come peaceably with me, we'll speak. We'll find a compromise that suits us both. You don't own a word like compromise, I said. You rent it to put on signs. Silas's smile thinned. He nodded at Judd, who stood behind Ivy with a rope in his hand and eyes alight with the pleasure of a man finally doing a job. So at last the world would tell him he was good at something. We don't have time for grace, Beckett said softly. Cass, do it, I said. He moved, and so did everyone else. Men are predictable and terrifying. Predictable in that they like to stack their movements in the same order every time. Terrifying in that they will do it even when a girl is standing on a box with her wrists tied and a rope in a man's fist. The sheriff raised his hand. Judd lifted the loop. Beckett ran straight at him like the only road left. Vale's riders cut diagonal. I went where only a woman will think to go, in from the side, low, where men don't look because they have been taught all their lives that danger is tall. I hit Judd behind the knees. He went surprised, and I went with him because I had learned the lesson ropes teach. Don't give slack. The loop fell. It brushed Ivy's cheek. Beckett's hand found it and threw it like a snake into the weeds. Two of the sheriff's men went for their guns. Vale's riders shot those guns into the air by not missing the hands. Silas ducked instinctively and then looked up, affronted that instinct had overruled breeding. It might have ended there, untidy, but ended, except Merritt makes his money on turns exactly like that. He had men in the cottonwood roots we hadn't seen. They rose like weeds after rain, and two of them put a pistol in the small of Beckett's back, and one put a hand over Ivy's mouth. I spun. A fourth had been waiting for me. He caught my elbow. So sharp I saw sparks. Enough, Merritt said, stepping from shade to sun as if an audience had demanded a bow. "This is dull." He pulled his watch from his waistcoat with delicate fingers and clicked it open. "We're late." He looked at me over the rim of it. "Mr. Kestrel is precise. He appreciates punctuality." He snapped the watch closed. "Tie the elder one. Make it quick this time. We're not writing a novel." The elder one, me. Silas put up a hand. "August," he said, half pleading, half annoyed, as if Merritt were a dog mudding his boots. "There's a less visible path." "Then walk it," Merritt said without looking at him. "Take your papers. We've got other chores." He nodded. The man behind me slid the noose up, not careful, the rope burning the skin the earlier loop had already stung. Beckett stopped breathing. Not entirely. He held it like a man holds a plank flat, while a friend hammers. Vale had his gun out, slow, so no one made a fool's error and shot a woman in a crowd, and none of Merritt's men looked at him because Merritt had said not to, and men like that have turned obedience into a spine. Ivy made a noise that didn't sound like any word we teach girls, only like human ache. I turned my head enough to catch her and said the only 2 words I had time for and knew would be of use. "I know." Merritt looked at the frame like an artist examines his own painting for value. "It's messy," he said, almost to himself. "But sometimes a town needs a stain to remember what color clean is." Beckett lifted his voice in prayer, not to God, to time. "August," he said, "you're clever enough to understand what happens if you do this. It stops being about a river. It starts being about a woman's throat. Kestrel loses the church ladies. He loses the market. He loses me." "You're lost already, Merritt," Lou said cheerfully. "You just haven't noticed." Then a thing happened that pulled the yard sideways. The ground shook once, like an enormous animal had turned in its sleep under us. Men looked up with eyes they pretend are not superstitious. The willow leaves shivered with no wind. A boy on the edge of the crowd yelled, "The river!" Merritt swore under his breath and jerked his chin at a runner who took off east. He looked like a man trying to decide which coin to spend, the one that bought him spectacle or the one that bought him success. He put the coin in the river's. "Slot later," he said, irritated, and flicked his fingers. The rope slid off my neck. My knees went damp. "Silas, fetch your ledger girl on your own time. I've got a gate to open." He pivoted and in 3 seconds was in the saddle and on the road and taking a dozen with him. He didn't look back. Men like him never look back. They think it makes the past not exist. What he left looked like the husk when locusts move on. Rope stubs, dust, the ache in my throat, the ache in Ivy's eyes, the ache in a town that had to choose again and again, which hurt to bear. Beckett was at me in 2 steps, and then at Ivy, hands leaving one to touch the other like he was learning, to multiply mercy. Vale stood with his gun lowered but not put away, and the riders around him started breathing full again, all at once, like a choir that had been waiting for the conductor to remember them. "Go," I said to Beckett before he could ask. "You heard it. The river's made up its mind to remind us what it can do." "You're not coming," he said, echoing himself from an hour ago, but with a different weight. "I am," I said. "Doc's jar is in my bag. The map is too. The judge won't come for our pretty faces. He'll come for a truth he can taste on his tongue and read under his finger. That means I ride." He looked like he hated me for being right and loved me for being the kind of woman who makes right heavy enough to carry. "Vale," he said. "I'll bring 4, Vale answered. "I'll leave Wit to watch your back trail. Miss May," he added without turning his head, "if anyone tries to be a fool while we're gone, hit him with that wheel." May thumped the wood with her palm. "I've been itching all afternoon." We rode the east road with the rest of the riders, company dust ahead of us like a taunt, our own dust rising like a promise behind. The river's voice grew and deepened. The schoolhouse bell rang a single mismatched note, someone's hand frightened and wanting to feel useful. Then Stopped as if the hand had remembered prayer is work too. At Devil's Gate the water came wrong. It didn't surge like a flood. It pulsed, thick, like a throat trying to swallow a lie and failing. On the spillway, men in kestrel shirts ran like beetles whose rock had been kicked. At the control house, the padlock we'd watched cut lay, open like a wound. The side gate lever stood full down again, and water shouldered through it mean. Merritt stood on the catwalk, shouting orders that made sense if you didn't understand rivers. Men obeyed them because they didn't understand rivers. Two wrestled a crate toward the spillway's lip. Another ran with a coil of fuse like a snake that had consented to be held while it decided who to bite. "Powder," Beckett said. And something in him hardened so quietly I nearly missed it. He didn't spur. He didn't shout. He lifted his hand, and Vale's riders opened out. 2 to the far bank, 2 to the foot of the catwalk, 1 to circle wide and take the ridge so we weren't shot in the back by a boy with a borrowed rifle and an ambition. Doc met us at the footing, face set. "They'll blow the lip to let the side gates rush eat a trench," he said. "Then they'll call the whole thing an act of God." He pressed his mouth into a line that had sorrow on both ends. "God's tired of being blamed for men's math." "Where's the powder?" I asked. "Under," he said. "They stashed crates in the sub-cellar. You can smell the resin if you put your face to the boards." "I'll go," I said. "You'll choke," he said. "I choked this morning," I said. "I can do it again." Beckett didn't argue. He's learned the difference between telling a woman the limits of her lungs and letting her choose them. "Brazos with you," he said. "If you can't drag a crate, cut it open and throw sticks. Don't touch caps. If you see a fuse lit—" He didn't finish. He didn't have to. "I'll be on the catwalk." He went, fluid, the way he always goes when the world asks him to decide what kind of man he is right now. Vale's men answered his movement as if a rope ran between them. I went down. The sub-cellar was a throat. Stone wet, wood damp, smell of sap and something sharper that made my eyes run. Brazos swore once softly and then swallowed his cussing like you do when a church door swings open while you're in mid-word. The crates were there, in a line under the spillway's belly, their slats beaded with moisture, their corners tarred. I set my palms to one and pulled. It moved like a mule that knows it could move faster if it respected you. "Here," Brazos said, and dug his rope out. "We'll make the stubborn thing think it's a calf." We looped it, braced, leaned. The crate slid. The river above groaned like a headache. On the catwalk, Beckett met Merritt the way men do when they have orders to give and have decided they will not give them to each other. I saw them in fractioned glimpses between timber, Beckett's shoulders squared, Merritt's hat tipped back, a long fuse coiled at their boots like a sleeping snake that had begun to dream of huge dark grass. "You don't know how to carry." "Wait," Beckett said. "You only know how to make other men do it," Merritt grinned. "I know how to make a river carry it," he said, and nodded at a boy with a match. I didn't think, I didn't pray. I went to my knees and drove my hand into the crate we'd dragged and came up with sticks of powder wrapped in paper none of us had read and threw them one after another into the low pool where the water swirled lazy, then looked up a rib's width and saw a second fuse. Not the long snake I'd watched at their feet, but a short one tucked like a secret under the catwalk. It had been lit. It hissed like meat fat dropped on a hot skillet. It ran under the plank, where no one's boot would. "Feel it because the world is terrible and clever. Beckett!" I shouted. He didn't look down. He moved. A boot tore a plank. His hand went under and came back with the fuse between 2 fingers. It burned his skin. He pinched. It died. Relief is a trickster. It made my knees weak in the moment that mattered most, because the long fuse at their feet was lit too. Merritt had held a match to it like a man holds a woman's wrist, almost tender, owning too much. He smiled at me while he did it, as if he were promising me a future. "Don't fret," he said over the rush. "It won't be a big bang. Just enough to make a point your ledger will understand." I climbed. The ladder's rungs were slick. A man swung a shovel at my knuckles. I dropped, caught, climbed again. Brazos cursed where he hauled a second crate into the pool. Doc yelled my name the way a man does when he needs you to hear his fear and his respect all at once. Beckett went for the long fuse. Merritt went for him. Two bodies moved in that narrow world, the way a pair of toms fight under a porch, fast, ugly, purposeful. Vale shot a man who had decided to help Merritt with a bullet that took the idea out of his shoulder without stealing. His life, a boy with a cap box, ran and tripped and cried out like a child because he was one. I reached the catwalk and lunged and got my hand on the fuse's middle. The end burned toward me, as if it had been waiting to reach the place where a woman's skin is softer. I wrapped my hand in my skirt and felt heat seep through fabric the way a rumor does through a small town, and pinched like Beckett had pinched the first. It hissed and guttered and went out and came back to life because powder is nothing if not stubborn. "Stomp it," Beckett said, not looking. And I did, and it died, and the world held like a held breath. And then something else woke. A hiss. From below, under, in the sub-cellar where I had just been, a third fuse. I saw it without seeing it, the line you tie when you don't trust the first line. The littler snake under the long snake. I went over the rail, the way you only do when you have made up your mind which thing matters and which thing doesn't. "Cass!" Beckett shouted, and the last of the day's gentleness fell clean out of his voice. He couldn't come. Merritt held him in a prayer lock, and a man with broken knuckles had decided to be brave at exactly the wrong moment, and Vale couldn't make his bullet decide between two terrible necessities. I fell to the sub-cellar floor, the way a sack of flour falls, and the air went out of me so I couldn't say the thing I wanted it to be, the last sound my sister would ever hear me make, which was her name. I crawled. The hiss ran under plank and into a crack where water made. Rotten rot made space, and space made the sound feel larger. I shoved my arm into that black and found heat and pinched, and this time when it died, I let the skin sizzle and didn't let go until I had spat on it and heard it surrender. Above me, boots thundered in both directions. Someone laughed hysterically. Someone prayed in Spanish. Someone dropped a hammer. The river shoved its shoulder against the gate, and the gate shoved back, and in that argument was a town. Hands grabbed my collar and jerked me up, and I came with them because my legs were not useful, and my lungs were not in the mood. Beckett's face hung above me like a piece of sky a child has drawn. Square, blue-eyed, stern, a little wrong, because love makes realism a fool. "Breathe," he said. I did. The world slid back into its place and regretted it. Merritt stood 20 feet away with his hat off and a calm on his face that made me realize he had not put all his coins in one slot. He had one more in his palm, and he had just spent it. "Enough," he said, not to us, to the river. It answered not with a surge, with a sound, low, long, the kind of sound you hear in a barn before a roof says it's had its fill of snow. The dam did not fail. A piece of the abutment, a small one, shifted. Water found it. Water is patient. It widened the crack, like a woman. "Widens a door with a hip she has used all her life. Pull back," Beckett said. Not to Merritt, to us. Off the catwalk, everyone off. We moved. Men moved. Merritt didn't. He stood and watched the hairline widen with a fascination that would have made a poet if the world had loved him different. "There," he said softly. "There we are." "Rope," I said then, in a voice that seemed to come from someone older and calmer than I feel I will ever become. "Give me rope." Brazos, bless him, didn't ask why. He handed me the coil he'd brought to pull crates. I didn't look at Beckett because if I did I would have had to explain, and there wasn't breath for that. I looped the rope around the catwalk stanchion and tied the knot my father taught me when I was 8, and Ivy was 5, and we were playing boat in the irrigation ditch and didn't notice it had teeth. I tied it to my waist. I tied it to a ring bolt that had been set into the control house wall by an engineer who had loved a woman who wanted him to come home at night. Then I threw the free end down to the subcellar and went after it. No, Beckett said, the only word he had time for that could carry all of the other words. Cass! There are caps, I said into the dark. If they stay dry, this all can be undone. If they get wet... I didn't say the math. He knew it. He swore once, softly, and the swearing sounded like love. The caps were where a careful enemy would hide them, up high on a shelf above where damp could get. Inside a tin someone had labeled in elegant script, Ledger Ink. I nearly laughed, and then the laugh went somewhere it needed more air than this to make a sound. I reached, and the subcellar shook, and I felt the rope catch, and I heard above a man shout like a hinge breaking, and I got my hand around the tin and yanked it down, and a plank split out of the ceiling, and the river breathed in my face. Up, Beckett said, not making a sentence of it because he didn't have to. The rope took 1/3 of my weight, my arms took another third, the muscle that remains in a woman when a day has taken, everything else took the last. I passed the tin up. Hands, Doc's sure and kind, took it. I reached again. The rope ran through my palm and left a mark that will be with me when I'm old, and tell girls in a parlor not to marry a man who smiles when the law is mentioned. I reached again, and the subcellar coughed, and the world tilted, and then we were out. Rope, tin, woman, and the catwalk sang a note I will hear in my sleep forever. Back, Beckett said again. Everyone back. He had his hand on my arm, and Ivy's name in his mouth, and Merritt's calm in the corner of his eye, and Vale's riders making a wall where there had not been one, and Doc shoving the tin into his satchel like a midwife hiding. A secret, and the river saying, I have turned, and I am coming. Cass, Ivy said. I turned. She should have been at the footing with May. She wasn't. Silas had her by the elbow, like a gentleman steering a debutante out for a dance. And in his free hand, at his side where only a woman who has learned to notice what men plan below the level of their mouths would look, a fuse. Not lit. Not yet. Leading into the control house under the window frame I had not seen because I had been counting other things. Let her go, I said. My voice had no lace on it. We're late, he said, mild. Mr. Kestrel hates late. He says it's rude to a future. He lifted the match the way a man lifts a pen to sign a contract. He looked at Beckett. Stand very still, Mr. Rourke. Beckett did not stand still. He took one step forward, and that is all the time there was, because at that step Silas struck the match and held it near the fuse, and the world went as small as a flame and as large as a valley. The match blossomed. The fuse caught. It hissed into the dark under the sill where my eyes couldn't follow, and my mind could. I ran, and Beckett ran, and Vale swore, and the river made its low sound, and Merritt laughed because a man does sometimes when all the coins he hid up his sleeve start to fall without him even having to throw them. Ivy twisted. She bit Silas's hand, and he shouted something educated and cruel and let go. And she ran to me, and we collided, and I shoved her behind the stone of the footing, and I turned, and there were two choices left to the day. The fuse under the sill, or the crack in the abutment that the river had decided to love like a slow-burning wick of its own. Cass, Beckett said. He didn't say which. He didn't tell me who to be. I picked. I went for the fuse. It hissed. It crawled. It disappeared into a black that smelled like tar and river and promise, and ended somewhere I could not get, not with the time a match has, not with the time a woman gets in a world that likes to watch her race itself. I dropped to my knees and put my mouth to the seam and dragged air in and blew like the day depended on my lungs, because it did. The flame fluttered and grew sulky, and then stood again, proud of itself for disobeying a woman. I tasted sulphur and rope and the raw of fear at the back of my tongue where the first loop had burned it. Somewhere above, Merritt made a pleased sound that will salt my food in memory forever. Somewhere below, water found a new crack and laughed in it. The flame went out, then woke. I had one breath left that wasn't promised to the river or my sister. Put it on the fuse, it guttered. I heard a sound like a choir starting a note and couldn't tell if it came from the river or the powder or the town. And the fuse, on the last inch. The last hair flared bright again and ran into the wall and vanished. The world held its breath with me. Then, from inside the control house, in the dark place where men say the word staging and mean it, a new hiss rose. Not one fuse, two. The second, burned invisible under the floor, toward the crates we'd left when Merritt walked in. Fast as a lie, it reached wherever it had been tied. It smiled. And the control house, with all its maps and levers and polite rail for Easterners, breathed in and waited to breathe out. The control house breathed in, waited, and then breathed out. It was not a cannon blast at first, not the thunder a boy imagines when he says the word explosion under his breath to taste the power of it. It was a cough, a contained thump from inside the bones of the building, followed by a ripple through plank and brace that made everything around us remember. It had been a tree once, and the trees do not like to be lied to. Down? Beckett's voice carried across wood and water. In the same breath as the first pane shattered and flew, the catwalk bucked underfoot. The air went sharp with the smell of resin and struck matches. The river answered with a low, angry note, as if insulted that men thought to choreograph it with powder. A second thump answered the first from deeper in, smaller, wrong, the sort of sound that makes a midwife lift her head because the baby just decided to be stubborn on its way out. The windows on the east side blew, flinging glitter into sunlight. A tongue of flame licked paper inside. The neat map with its colored threads lifted and twisted and tried to leave this story. I had the absurd thought that a thing drawn to control, a river would like not to burn, but to run. Cass! Ivy's voice from the footing, raw, too big for her throat after what the rope had taught it, pulled my eyes and found her there between May and Doc's satchel, white as fresh lime and stubborn as God's own mulishness. "I'm here," I said, and tasted soot. "Stay down." August Merritt did not throw himself to the timber. He didn't flinch when a shard winged past his ear and nicked his cheek. He stood very still, his hat in his hand, watching the control house as if he were listening to an aria, and waiting for the soprano to hit the exact note he had paid for. The control house obliged. A third blast, smaller still, fluttered the door on its hinges and puffed flame like a bellows. The old beautiful sadness that sits inside smoke found our lungs. Men shouted not in fear, but in the work language that makes fear stand aside. "Bucket! Rope lever shut now!" The crack, Doc said to no one and everyone. He pointed with his chin to the abutment's shoulder. Where it had been a hairline, it was a thread. Where it had been a thread, it was now a seam. Water found it and pressed, the way a hand finds a pulse and insists it name itself. "We've got minutes," Beckett said. Calm words meant to settle a stampeding thing, not hours. Minutes. He met my eyes across the catwalk, and I saw there the ledger of a man who knows which lines can be revised later and which will ruin the book if they're written wrong right now. "Main gates," he said. "We open or she tears herself." I nodded. There are moments when the body, however tired, remembers who it belongs to. Mine found steadiness where none should have been and stepped onto plank again. Vale swung in on my left without asking permission. "2 hands on the wheel," he said. "On 3. We didn't get 3. We got 2. Then Merritt laughed, small and satisfied, and my foot slid because men who intend to break a thing will oil its handles to make honesty harder. Beckett's hand found the back of my collar and steadied without making a show of saving. Vale cursed between his teeth. We set our shoulders to the iron and leaned like farmers with a stubborn mule. The wheel shrieked and moved a finger. Below, water reached in through the seam and came away with a crumb of concrete. It tried again and took more, patient as scripture read every day for a year. Again, Beckett said. We gave it. The wheel grudged, then turned, slow, every notch a price. The gate below answered by a hair, then by a palm's width. The river threw its shoulder in a different place, and the catwalk sang a lower note as pressure shifted. Hold her, Vale, said we held. Somewhere in the building a fourth pop, more a spit than a blast, added insult to injury. The flame licked a rafter and decided to stay. Merritt said, to no one, there. It wasn't triumph. It was satisfaction the way a banker feels it when columns match what he meant them to match. Men down there with the sluice, Beckett shouted. Stay with it. Two of Vale's riders flashed like parentheses at the bottom of my sight. Bodies. Braced to turn a wheel below while we turned one above. One slipped. The other swore him back to standing with words a mother would pop a boy in the ear for using if she loved him as much as she pretended to. Doc took the tin of caps, my palm remembered its weight, and shoved it into his bag, as if it were a baby. And men had finally learned they were the kind of men who ought to carry babies instead of breaking things. May knelt with Ivy and pressed a wet cloth to the wheel at her throat and to the one at mine when I came past for breath. You'll have a mark, she said, not gently. Let it remind you you're not quiet. Quiet, I echoed, and put my shoulder to iron again. The wheel moved another spoke. The gate answered with a thud you could feel in your kneecaps. The spillway took a wider white. The pressure on the crack changed song. Not safe, not yet. But not the note the earth makes when men make math out of greed. Hold, Beckett said, his mouth close to my ear, breath rough, hair damp at the temple. We get her to a third, and she'll take the hurt without giving way. We found that. Third like a woman finds a last strength in labor. She swore she didn't have and never wanted to prove she had, and will later hate the world for making her use. Every notch turned belonged to hands that had worked rope and shovel all their lives. Beckett's jaw set and set again. The range of motion a man allows himself when he is making a small room inside pain where the work can sit and not be bothered. Merritt put his hat back on. His cut had stopped bleeding. He hopped onto the nearest brace with a grace that told me he had been a boy who enjoyed climbing things he had been told not to. You'll cook in there, he called, conversational as two men leaning over a fence. Open it farther and you'll take the whole cross brace. Then you'll bless me for my map. I've got a finer one in my desk with a line drawn to the future. It passes right through your church. Get off the timber, Vale said. Or I'll shoot you in a place you'll still be able to, technically, father children, but you won't like it. Merritt laughed. You can't shoot me, he said, as if stating an ordinance. You're the men who came to be seen, not pulling a trigger. He tipped two fingers off his hat to me. The women will like that in the minutes. The world tilted. Not the catwalk, me. It lasted a heartbeat, long enough for my stomach to step off into air and then find plank again. The rope's morning lesson had taken more of me than I'd allowed my pride to admit. Beckett felt it through the wheel and shifted his grip so I could steal one breath that belonged to him. He didn't look at me while he did it. He looked at the river like it was a horse he was not going to let fall. One more, he said. We took one more, and the gate gave like a barn door, finally consenting to turn on hinges, too long neglected. Water rolled through, thick, then smoother. Pressure bled off its madness and remembered what flow is. The seam in the abutment kept its ambition, but stopped courting immediate glory. Off, Beckett said then, an order that had nothing to do with triumph and everything to do with the catwalk's aching timbers. We came down the braces like men off a roof that had flirted too long with collapse. Merritt remained where he was, and for one raw second I wished Vale would shoot him in whatever place he had chosen, and I do not apologize to God for that thought. A town that has watched a rope kiss its daughters is allowed poor theology for an hour. Beckett put his palm over mine and pressed, not to keep me from moving, but to remind my body it had one. Breathe, he said. Working on it, I said, and the corner of his mouth recognized the territory of that small joke and touched it with the respect such territory deserves. The control house exhaled one last time, glass coughing out of frames, paper giving up altogether, and then settled into a mess we could name. The river sang a new note, still swollen, still proud, but less dangerous. The catwalk stopped humming fear and began humming fatigue. Men lowered shoulders and raised heads. The afternoon remembered it was not yet night. Merritt hopped down. "Well done," he said, pleased, as if he had trained us and we had performed. "You saved your ugly little town." He looked past me to where Ivy stood with May. "For now." Ivy met his eyes and did not flinch. I felt something settle in me at that. The line between then and after. "You could have killed me," she said to him, and her voice didn't shake. "You tried." "I tried to teach a lesson," he said gently. "Men are fond of education." "And poor students," she said. He touched his cut and smiled at the red on his finger. "See you at the meeting, Miss Morell," he said to me. "I prize order more than air. It will be orderly." He tipped his hat. He walked away. He did not run. He didn't need to. He had used the hours the way a wolf uses dusk. "Cass," Doc said, and his voice had a different weight, the responsible one that makes a room hush. "The mark at your throat needs cooling. Ivy's too. And then you need to sit 12 minutes before you try to run again." 12, I asked, amused by the exactness. He lifted a brow. "I like prime numbers when a woman will ignore me either way." He turned his attention to Beckett's hands. "You're burned." "Later," Beckett said, and did not look at his skin. He looked at my sister, and then at the road that led back to town. "We've got to put eyes on the office before they put a match to paper." Vale spat in the river like a benediction. "Which there," he said. "If anyone strikes fire near your father's ledger, he'll break fingers for the Lord." "Then we go," I said. "Doc, keep the jar where a fall won't break it." She was already pressing a damp cloth to my neck with a tenderness edged in fury. "Go," she said. "If a man in a suit tries to speak louder than me, I'll discover whether a wheel makes a better argument than a skillet." The ride back felt shorter because the world had been shaved of everything extra. Air, hooves, dust that tasted like metal where the river had flung a breath. The town lifted itself up to meet us, the way a child lifts arms when it sees its mother's shape on the road. Too much faith and just enough. The church steps held the town. Not seated, standing with. That particular tension a room acquires when people have chosen to be witnesses instead of gossips. Reverend Thorne's face looked carved and bright, like someone had held him close to a fire until the heat drew out whatever sapped men when fear sits in their bones too long. The schoolhouse bell rope lay coiled like a tired snake. Old May stood near the door with that wheel tucked like a shield into the crook of her arm. She looked as if she had always been made of oak and patience, and would be long after all of us were stories. Silas stood at the front table with the sheriff and 3 deputies who had not yet decided what courage meant under new light. If the lemon smell was less, the smile was the same. "Neighbors," the Reverend began, and his voice went where men's voices rarely go. It went soft. "We have come back from a work none of us chose, and all of us did. We will do some more. We will do it like people who intend to live in the same town when the sun comes up. Sit if you can, stand if you must. We're going to put truth on the U. And table." "Order," Silas said sweetly, as if the word were a pet he'd trained. "Sheriff." "Let him speak," someone said from the back. Vale, though he didn't lift his chin to claim it, Silas put on the sorrow of a man who has discovered children tracked mud onto his carpet. "Miss Morell has brought accusations. She has stirred tempers and rivers. She has interfered with lawful improvements. She has—" "I have done my father's work," I said. "I didn't raise my voice. I simply set it inside the room, like you set a pot on a stove." The heat changed. "I have kept the accounts straight, and I have tried to keep the girls safe." I touched my throat because the mark was a friend now. You've met the truth's cost. You'll meet its arithmetic too. I laid the ledger down. Treasurer Morell, inked on the inside cover by a hand I knew better than my own. Boxy, proud, a little battered. I set Doc's jar beside it. Vale put the rolled map down with a neatness that made men notice it wasn't just a woman's argument anymore. Doc cleared his throat. "This is tailings wash," he said. "If you put it on your tongue, the tongue will tingle and go dull. Then your hands will shake when you try to pour a cup. If you drink it long enough, your baby's milk will spoil." He didn't look at Silas when he said it. He looked at the women who had carried babies and watched milk and learned the smell of danger before men had a word for it. Silas smiled for the men who think words make a room behave. "We appreciate the theatrics," he said. "But the county has approved the dam. We have improved your lot. The river is safer now than it has ever been." He lifted his neat paper. "Here are the contracts. Read the one you tried to feed me," Old May said, scratching her cheek with the corner of her wheel. "The one with my name forged worse than a boy trying to copy his father's hand." Silas's smile thinned. "Miss May, the language of contract is not suited to women," she supplied. "To non-parties," he said. He looked at me and tried a different key. "Miss Morell, we can settle this reasonably. Sign here that you misinterpreted. Your father's books and the county will forgive your trespass at the gate. Mr. Kestrel will even, in his largesse, fund a new schoolhouse roof." I touched the ledger. It felt warm, like a hand. "My father taught me to read men who offer roofs," I said. "They've usually stolen a door." He sighed in a way that suggested I had disappointed him by reminding him I had a mind. "Sheriff," he said, "arrest her." The sheriff stepped forward 2 paces and stopped at a line that existed only because men in that room had decided it did. It was marked not by chalk, but by May's wheel and Beckett's shoulder and Vale's easy hand on a gun he had not yet drawn. It was marked by boys whose knuckles were still scabbed from planting and had somehow set into fists. It was marked by women who had tucked children behind them with one hand and something heavy behind their skirts with the other. The sheriff lifted a palm to show he had some sense left in his body, and his badge had not entirely eaten his brain. "We'll hear it," he said. "Then we'll do it by the book." "By the ledger," Reverend Thorne corrected, and the room let the smallest laugh out, carefully, like a fragile thing that would help the breathing. He gestured to me. "Show us." I opened my father's book and read the story it had learned. To tell, not with heat, with clarity. A line is a confession if you don't let it dress. I read the county credits against oil purchases that never sat on our shelves. I read the rope entries and whose hand had signed for delivery at the town yard. I read the hooks. I read the word staging from a map that had burned in part and survived in whole because lies are lazy when it comes to their paperwork. I let Doc raise the jar and say the names of metals the body can't abide. I didn't say Merritt's name often. I didn't need to. It hovered like gun smoke. Silas stood ready to answer each clean number with a fog. "Misallocation," he said. "Reclassification." He pointed to receipts with a finger so elegant, even his fingernail looked trained to sit up straight. "Those hooks are hanging on a frame in the willow yard," I said. "Drying racks," he said, "for the school children's paintings," May added sweetly, and the women laughed then, open, full, a sound not of humor, but of recognition. "When the Emperor walks past and someone finally says he's wearing air." "Blasting powder," Vale said. "Control house." He dropped a splintered slat on the table. "Company stencil, resin, tar." The smell reached the first pew, and men in the second leaned because the body knows a lie by its nose before the mind catches up. "Emergency measures," Silas said. "A contingency to make the dam safe." "For whom?" Doc asked. Silas tilted his head in a way that meant I was supposed to be charmed by his restraint. "For progress," he said. "Progress doesn't need a noose," Ivy said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The room rearranged itself around it. She lifted her braid off her shoulder so the mark could be seen. Not as cheap theatre, but as a line item. A man in a ledger will have to write in his own blood if he insists on balancing his books. I don't care for improvements that ask me, not to breathe while they happen. Order, Silas said, and for the first time all day the word sounded silly. Reverend Thorne lifted the Bible, then set it down again without quoting. Enough! He looked at the sheriff. You have heard the evidence. You watched the yard, you saw the rope, you smelled the powder. If you do not act tonight, you will leave this church without a town to wear a badge in. The sheriff breathed through his nose, then through his mouth. His jaw worked. He looked like a man choosing not between right and wrong, but between two kinds of fear. I'll take the map, he said finally to Doc. And the jar. His eyes flicked to me and did not stay. We'll wire Carson City. Silas's mouth made a little O. Sheriff, he said, you are not authorized. Authorized, the sheriff said, tasting the word and finding it no longer matched his tongue. He shifted his belt. Mr. Bracken, you and Mr. Merritt will remain within town limits until a judge has read these. His voice found an old carriage behind it then, something he might have had before the county bought him a new vest. Deputy, he added to one of the three whose hands hadn't shaken earlier, go fetch Mr. Merritt from the gate if he's come back this way. If not, ride. Silas's eyes cooled. You'll regret this, he said softly. Already do, the sheriff said, and for the first time today I believed him. We adjourned without adjourning. People spilled into twilight in twos and threes with the quiet of ones who know the night has a kind of brittle to it. May gathered women into a circle that looked like knitting. Vale spoke to his riders with his chin, and they broke like a clean platoon. 2 to the jail, 2 to the yard, 2 to the office. Doc took Ivy's pulse and then mine, and said to both, of us, eat soup. If you drink whiskey, I will hide your glasses, and if you don't sleep, find a chair that fits your back and pretend. Beckett walked beside me without touching me, because sometimes touch makes it worse when a body is trying to keep its shape. You shook when the gate moved, he said after we had gone 10 steps with the town at our back. He said it like inventory, not like a man pointing to a weakness with pride at his own steadiness. Sit somewhere while I go talk to Vale at the jail. I will, I lied. You won't, he said, and that gentled the word somehow, because he had accounted for me not obeying and still made the ask. Then at least breathe before you follow. If you see Merritt, don't be brave, be loud. Bravery's a tax, I said. Noise is a weapon. He almost smiled. You're learning ranching fast. He tipped his hat and moved toward the jail with the gait a man has, who has decided he'll be as much law as the town needs until the judge arrives. Ivy tugged my sleeve. Come, she said. May will make us sit if she thinks we mean to stand. May did. She tucked us into her front room with bowls that steamed lentil and ham and a slice of bread thick as a good Bible. She pressed a cool cloth to our throats and said, to hell with beauty standards for a week, which made a laugh open in me that did not belong to today and so felt like a cheat and a balm. We'll be watched, she said, looking past us through the lace curtain. So we'll be visible. You want to scare a snake? Let him see you knitting. She thrust needles and yarn into Ivy's hands and a tarnished thimble into mine, not to sew with, but to roll on my thumb like a worry stone. We sat for exactly 12 minutes because Doc had asked, and I'm not so stubborn as to make a liar of the only man trying to keep an entire town's blood inside its skin. We listened to the sound a town makes after it decided together not to be frightened, into being smaller, not silence exactly, something like a held chord that expects the next note to be true. Then we rose and went to the jail. The sheriff had done the simplest brave thing. He had put Silas Bracken in a cell. Bracken stood with his coat folded across his arm, his hat set on the cot like a guest nobody meant to entertain. He looked appallingly like a teacher waiting for a class of slow students to assemble. "Mr. Merritt?" Beckett asked. "Gone," the deputy said. "East." "Of course," Silas said mildly. "One does not linger where the rabble outnumber the reasoned." He studied me. "Miss Morell, I fear for you that you have enjoyed today too much. There is a deliciousness in tipping a thing off its moorings. It leaves a woman shaky and bright, and certain no civic order deserves her obedience. Then morning comes. The order remains. The woman grows tired. I set my hands on the bars, because the day had taught me how to hold things that had tried to strangle me. "You mistake me for a woman who enjoys any of this," I said. "There is nothing about you that is delicious." He winced as if I had misused a fork at a formal dinner. "You will come to my office tomorrow," he said. "You'll sign what I put in front of you. We'll return to improvements. This interlude will become a story you tell when you want." Applause at a kitchen table. He nodded at the sheriff. "And you will let me out." The sheriff shifted his weight. "We'll wait on the judge." Silas raised his brows in a performance of surprise. "You think a judge will choose town? Merchants over a company that delivers a railroad?" A voice came from the door. "I think a judge will choose his eyes." Old May didn't move aside. She simply angled her wheel to make room. A man in a black coat that had seen better dust stepped in, hat in his hands, hair parted like a book. On a lectern. He was not as old as the coat suggested, and not as soft as the hair implied. He had the look of a person who has given bad news for a living and has learned to do it in a way that tells the hearer how to keep breathing after the words land. A second man followed him, a federal deputy in a coat that looked like it had been slept in on purpose. "Judge Edom Pruitt," Reverend Thorne said behind them, relief and something like mischief in his voice. "His circuit runs mean as a cob, but his pony has a fondness for our oats. He took my wire on the trail." The judge nodded at the room like a man greeting a roomful of kin, whose better qualities he chooses to assume for the sake of dinner. "Evening," he said. "Show me your jars and your dead and your ropes." Not in that order. No one had died, by grace and grit. We showed him the ropes anyway. He touched the hemp with a thumb and did not make a noise, the sort of silence a man keeps when he intends to be loud later. Doc set the jar on the desk. The judge dipped a finger and touched it to his tongue, the way a farmer tastes a barrel to see if the salt cured. His lip went numb, and he nodded. "Tailings," he said, as if he were remarking on a pair of stolen boots. "Your Honor," Silas said, gentle as a tree rope under snow. "This is more dramatic than necessary. We have contracts with the county. We have permits. The county is not the river," the judge said, and set his hat on the peg as if he intended to be comfortable. "And the river isn't a bookkeeping column. Sheriff, you'll keep Mr. Bracken a guest of the county." He turned. Mr. Rourke. Beckett stepped forward. "Judge, you'll take 4 men," the judge said, "and ride east. If you catch the other one, Merritt, you'll return him on his horse if he'll sit it. If not, you'll drag him by his pride. Don't shoot him unless he offers a good reason. He will be creative in his reasons." He turned to me. "Miss Morell." I went cold down to the bones of my feet. "Sir, you'll bring me your father's ledger in the morning and sit while I read it. You'll bring me receipts. You'll tell me, without adjectives, which line sours the milk in your mouth when you say it. Yes, Your Honor." "And you'll sleep," he said, meeting my eyes until I had to look away and then had to look back. "Because this isn't over when a girl with rope marks wins the night. It's over when she keeps winning mornings." Ivy's fingers crept around mine, cold and certain. "We'll wake her," she said. The judge made a note in his pocketbook with a stub of pencil. "Sharper than a moralist." "Sheriff," he said, "put 2 men on the dam and 2 on the control house and arrest any man who strikes a match there without a prayer said first, and my signature on a paper." He turned to Vale. "And you'll tell me quietly if any Of your boys, feel bullet brave tonight so I can review with them the difference between satisfied and right. Vale tipped his hat in a modest confession. We will be peasants about it, he said. Proud and careful, the judge's mouth ticked. Good. He looked at Silas. Mr. Bracken, you are not the first man to learn at 35 that your handwriting won't talk as clean as your lips. I recommend you practice penance. He turned and left without grand flourish, only a purposeful bearing, as if the job were a ditch to dig and he had a spade tuned to clay. We spilled back into the evening and found the town changed by the simple presence of a man with a book and a travelling coat. It wasn't that he brought law where there had been none. It was that he brought a place for our tired to sit. Beckett touched the brim of his hat to me. I'll ride, he said. You'll rest. You'll come back, I said, because some words should be imposed like tithes. Count on it. He was gone with 4 riders before my heart had finished. The beat it had just begun. I watched the dust he made join the dust the day had raised and didn't let that feel like a metaphor. May's hand found my shoulder. Eat again, she said, and then lie down on my settee and pretend you trust. Furniture, Avi and I did the first. The second took stratagems, wet cloth, pillow that smelled like May's lavender pocket, Doc's dose of willow bark tea. The wheel leaned against the door like a promise. When sleep came, it came in strips, the way a poor quilt uses a dozen old dresses to make a new blanket. In the strips, I saw rope and water, Merritt's grin and Silas's neat hands and Beckett's boot braced under my heel. Each time I woke, Ivy's breath steadied mine. Each time she woke, my skin remembered how to be warm without someone else's eyes on it. Morning put a thin egg yolk light across the floor. The town felt like a mouth after a dentist has done his worst, numb, relieved, dreading the next appointment. The judge took the ledger on the church steps with no ceremony. He sat on the top step like a farmer on a fence and turned pages while people going to their chores glanced without gawking, and those who had no chores tried to look like they did. He read the way a good man sifts flour patiently, confident the weevils will present themselves if the sieve is true. When he looked up, he had the expression of a person who has found exactly what he expected to find, and is therefore allowed to be angry without being surprised. "Sheriff," he said, "send a rider to Carson City for the clerk who keeps the seal on water contracts. Send another to Devil's Gate for whatever engineer the company tolerates enough to ask questions of. And send a third to the 3V for any cowhand with eyes who will swear to what he saw." He shut the ledger gently. "Miss Morell, you will now answer me in 3 lines why you called the meeting, what you expected would happen and what did." I said the first. Water, rope, numbers. I said the second. A town crowding into a room and a lawyer pretending. A noose means art. I said the third. Attempt at murder turned into theatre, turned into proof. "Good," he said. "Don't practice rhetoric, Miss Morell. Leave that to the men who have not yet earned rope marks." He wrote something on a scrap and gave it to the sheriff. "Jail the deputy who took coin to look away from the yard," he said. "Not the one who asked questions, the other." The deputy in question went pale. The other stood taller. That is how to repair a town as quick as anything. Name the coward and praise the almost brave. By midday, news came from the East Road. Beckett's posse had found Merritt at a relay station, crisply shaving, as if a man might as well look presentable. While fleeing a town, he did not shoot. He smiled. It was not quite defeated, but it had a new line through it the way glass gets a birthmark after a bullet passes nearby. In the afternoon's heat, men with rolled sleeves and women with bandanas over their hair pulled the hooks down from the willow frame and stacked them on the church steps. We built, yes, we built, with our own hands, a gallows of a different sort, not for necks but for words. We lashed the hooks into an ugly iron cross and hung from them the map, the ledger's copy pages, Doc's jar with a ribbon through its wire, and a coil of rope soaked and salted, so that if some fool tried to throw it over a branch tonight, it would let him make a fool of himself, and not more. Silent in the heat it stood. Children asked and were told. Old men spat and were permitted. Out-of-towners looked and did not enter the saloon that afternoon. Lila put water on her piano and a sign on her door, "No songs for rope." At dusk, the judge held court in the church because the schoolhouse made his ears ring, he said, and the feedlot drew flies. We came empty-handed on purpose, so that words could dress us instead of weapons. The judge had the clerk from Carson City at his elbow, and the engineer from the gate on a chair with sawdust on it from a carpenter who had built a ramp that morning in case the judge wanted one. He called names. He said the law. He asked questions that cut sauce off sentences. He listened like men get saved when a preacher finally shuts his mouth and no longer tries to impress God with adjectives. He took Merritt's smile off one layer at a time. He took Silas's paper away and made him speak without it. He made the sheriff say, aloud, who had paid him and how and what he had told himself about a town's safety while he took the coins. He found in favor of a river. He issued what papers he could: suspension of work, impound of equipment, arrest of a contractor whose hands were too clean, and sent others to a court whose seal stood between hills and companies and meant to be heavy. He named a man from our town marshal pro tem, and it was not the sheriff, it was the deputy whose nudge had taken his partner toward a cell. The judge is a romantic that way about redemption, which is to say he is a practical man. He did not give a speech. He said, "Court is adjourned until the circuit's next pass," and put his hat on and his pencil away. He slept in May's spare room because she had the softest sheets. He left at dawn with coffee in a lard tin and crumbs on his lapel, and a note folded in his pocket that Doc had written in his neat hand, "Poison in water, see samples." He tipped his hat to me and said, "Keep writing," and to Beckett, "Keep." "Standing where she can see you," Beckett said, "Yes, Your Honor." And the yes sounded like a thing he had chosen and not been ordered to. We did not wake to a better world. We woke to a world we could breathe in without counting the seconds. Between breaths, they took Silas to Carson City under guard. Merritt rode with them and tried 3 jokes that didn't land. Weeks later, word came by way of Vale's man, who reads faster than anyone has a right. Indictments drawn, Kestrel writing checks to lawyers instead of surveyors, a federal man interested in the way ores turn to poison when run through a mill. Built for speed instead of caution. The sheriff resigned. He put his badge on the reverend's table without being asked to. He took a job mending fence for a man who treated him like a person who could learn to be one. Judd Pike went sullen, as men like that do when the world denies them the one job they had decided to be good at, and was seen sweeping the church steps twice a week for a month, as if shame, given a handle, can become service. We pulled down the willow frame and used the timber for a coat rack in the schoolhouse. 12 pegs, 12 places for boys to hang hats that would not hide faces. The iron hooks went to the smithy and came back as 24 hoes, handles smooth, iron lips sharp, put into the hands of women who grew food with them until the year turned. And someone said, "Remember when those were?" And Ivy said no, and the town said no, and the work put a different memory in the muscle. As for us, Ivy wore her hair up for a while because the mark made men stare at the wrong part of her. Then one Sunday she took it down, and the town minded its business because it had learned how. She stood with May behind a table at the schoolhouse and took coin for chalk, and in the column titled Ledger, she wrote not just numbers, but names. The children learned to make their letters small and their questions large. I stayed behind our counter because my father had not taught an eldest daughter to tuck herself into a marriage like a letter into an envelope addressed to a man. I kept the books. I kept minutes for the town meetings because the Reverend had better hands for baptizing and my hand did not shake when a man raised his voice. The first meeting after the judge left, we voted to fund a second bell, not for fires, for calling neighbours. The town yard got a new shed and a sign that said, "No rope stored here," and a smaller, angrier sign under it that said, "Ever." Beckett came in twice a week the way he always had. Hat set on the counter, step a shade softer on wood than it is on dirt. "You need anything carried?" he would ask, like asking was a way of letting a person write yes for their own reasons. Sometimes I said no and he carried anyway. Sometimes I said yes, and he let me lift the lighter end of the box, as if partnership begins where people stop performing and start doing. We didn't talk much those first weeks about rope or water. We talked about salt licks and calves, and whether the wind on his hill was different from the wind in town. He told me one morning how to set my breath when the air went thin inside. The store, the way it sometimes does when a day you thought you survived, sends its shadow in before lunch. "In through the nose slow," he said. "Hold while you count fence posts. Out through the mouth like you're calming a skittish foal." He had me try it, and when I had fussed, because it felt too simple to be a cure, I found air where air had been missing, and forgave the advice for being true. One late afternoon, as the shadows laid themselves long across sacks of feed, he put his hand on the counter and did not take it away when change rang against his palm. "You ever tire," he said, "of keeping everyone else's accounts?" "Some," I said, "and then I don't." "You ever think of the spread?" he asked. He wasn't offering a ring. He was offering a road. "I think of it when the town smells like creosote," I said. "You can breathe at my fence line when you need to," he said, and it was the kindest sentence a man had ever offered me that wasn't a poem, and therefore didn't have to keep its promise. Ivy took to riding Witt's old mare in the evenings, and I took to walking out past the willow yard toward the place where the ditch meets the river and learns to be more than it is. Beckett met me sometimes, without arranging it. We would stand without touching and talk about the way a child's laugh sounded like a bird you haven't heard since spring, and sometimes we would say nothing and listen to the river do the work we had put into it. The day, the first rain after. The gate fell. The town stood on porches smelling the dirt go dark and listened for the dam the way you listen for a neighbor's cough to quiet. It held. It will not hold forever. Nothing built by men does. But it will hold longer, because the day demanded honest math and got it. At harvest, we held a supper under lanterns strung between the schoolhouse and the church. The judge's letter came that morning. Progress in the capital, a hearing scheduled, a marshal to return with more questions, a new sheriff to be sworn in, an engineer fined. A company reminded that law is not just a noun, but a verb, protect. The letter had a coffee stain and a kind word for May's wheel and a P.S. that read, "Tell Miss Morell to keep writing names into ledgers that weren't built to hold them." We ate pies that did not apologize for their sugar, and the men from the mine who had worked all day came in with hands still black with ore and glory, and took plates from women who did not tell them to wash first, because a town that has learned what kind of clean matters will spend its water elsewhere. Lila sang a song she must have been holding since winter, something sweet as bottled peaches. Vale danced with a widow without the awkwardness men often bring to honest joy. Doc sat with his back straight and the easy smallness of a man who has seen a baby draw its first breath and therefore believes his work is worth the tired. Beckett stood at the yard's edge, the way he often stands when he feels too big for a room. I crossed to him without deciding to. He looked at my throat the way men who love you look. They see the mark and then choose to look past it without ever pretending it isn't still part of you. "Come walk," he said, and we did. To the willow stand that now held pegs for coats and stories with no place left to hang. The night smelled like crushed grass and new water and cake cooling on windowsills. "You keep choosing to stay," he said. It wasn't a question. It's the math that balanced, I said. If I leave, the column that says girls safe loses. A number I'm not willing to let it lose, he nodded. Then I'll keep riding in for salt, he said, and whatever else your hands decide to hand me. He looked at my fingers, which were still raw where rope and wheel iron had asked more of them than a life of tidy sums usually demands. Your father'd be proud, he said. Pride's what a dead man deserves if his girls don't drown, I said. It came out more tender than it reads here. He took off his hat and held it against his chest in the human way, not like a man. In a church who thinks the motion will buy him a pass, but like a man outdoors who remembers he is not the tallest thing under the sky and would like not to invite lightning. You saved us at the gate, he said simply. You saved us in the yard, I said. You cut the rope. I held it off you, he said, always honest. You cut the day apart where it needed a seam. He put his hat back on and leaned his shoulder into the willow because standing still is easier when you lean into something. I have a notion, he said. If the town votes a water board, you'll take the chair. And if they don't, then I'll nail a chair to the church steps, he said, and when men come to move it, I'll ask them how they intend to lift something a woman is sitting on. I laughed. I couldn't help it. You're getting good at this, I said. Language. I've been listening to you, he said, and that was the kind of compliment that sends a woman home to wash her face for the pleasure of seeing her own eyes without paint and knowing there is a man in the next valley who believes they're unarranged. Look is worth a place at his table. We walked back under lanterns. The town quieted the way a child does when it is so full of sugar, and running it must fall asleep upright against its mother's shoulder. May fell into a chair with the relief of a general at peace. Doc talked to a boy about doing sums that would let him into a school that had thought our valley too dusty to send a genius from. I sat at the far end of the table with the ledger open and wrote names under a new column we had not had before. Witnesses. I wrote them until my hand cramped and Ivy took the pencil from me and massaged the base of my thumb and then handed it back without a word, and I kept writing. When I finished, I closed the book and put my palm on it the way a woman puts a hand on a sleeping child's hair and hopes the night will be kind. Tomorrow, the judge will be back on his circuit. Tomorrow, merit will invent a new smile for a court. Tomorrow Silas will try to borrow ink from a different clerk. Tomorrow the dam will hold or it won't. Tomorrow the ledger will wait for my hand. But tonight, the river sounded like a thing we could sleep beside without watching it. Tonight the willow yard held coats, not ropes. Tonight a rancher stood where he could see me, and a town that once watched its own daughters tied stood where it could see itself and did not look away. And I, a woman with ropes handwriting on, her skin and ink under her fingernails, stood at the place where numbers and names and water meet and knew the taste of air again. 2 more great stories are next. Don't miss them. Subscribe and turn on notifications.